Thanks. Yeah, thank you all for being here. I appreciate it. You know, it's not always easy to get out. We're all busy. But at least you're given a good excuse to not be at home staring at your phone, right? So the topic for tonight is mental health and living in a digital world, raising children in a digital society. I have the sense that I'm a little bit preaching to the choir here, but I think that's a good thing. I'm hoping it enables us to sort of take the conversation maybe further than we normally would. I don't have to pull any punches, assuming that people are pretty much probably already familiar with some of the well-worn terrain on this topic. And also I have the sense that even if we're all in the choir, we're not quite singing in harmony yet, right? There's still a lot of different behaviors that parents are allowing their children to do, and sort of, you know, the messiness of the day-to-day is still really tricky, even if you've sort of read some of the books and you have a general sense of what the problem is and why we should be thinking about this. There's still work for us to do. And also this conversation is taking place in a sort of larger arc of a conversation that we're trying to have here in Kimberton, which is sort of building on the last lecture that I gave last month. And in that talk, I talked a little bit about trying to get us to think in a historical and evolutionary context, to get us to think about where we're coming from, where we're at, and where we're going as a species, as a planet. And I'm going to be bringing some of those themes back, because my sense is that it's ultimately very helpful and maybe essential for us to really be able to take a step back and think about what's happening, not just in the day-to-day, week-to-week headlines and problems and crises, but in a sort of bigger narrative and a bigger story that hopefully gives meaning and purpose to our lives together. So with that, you know, thank you for your gift of attention for the next hour or so. I'm also hoping to have some wonderful Q&A. I thought that went really well last time, so as a question arises for you this evening, please hold on to it and share it later. And it's a good chance for us to sort of practice one of the sort of tenets or principles that I'll be trying to convey this evening, which is the importance of attention, right? Like here we are together, sharing attention the way people have been doing together for millennia. And sometimes that in itself can feel different or strange. It's actually hard to just pay attention to a lecture for an hour. So I'm making you work. And I think that that's a good and actually very important thing for people to have to do once in a while. So you're welcome. Last thing I'll say on that too is just, you know, I want to bring a little bit of a Waldorf Steiner frame to what we're doing, and part of the one of the underlying principles that I'm working with here is that as humans, as adults, as leaders of families and schools and our community, we are trying to cultivate our thinking and bring it into alignment with our feeling and our willing, right? So we're trying to think deeply about these topics. We're trying to calibrate and work with all the different feelings that come up in the stress and the anxiety and the overwhelm of the world we're living in today. And sort of, as I was implying by the notion that we should be singing in harmony together, how we act in the world, how we are able to align our wills in the world is ultimately what's really important. And with that, I'll start with a quote from Rudolf Steiner, who said, "Do not begin by asking, 'What must I do?' and 'What must others do?' For the majority of people today, such questions are inopportune. The important question is, how do I gain insight into the present situation? When one has adequate insight, one will follow the right course." And that is definitely a premise that I'm operating under tonight. I'm not going to give you, this isn't about getting a list of these are the 5 things that you should do with your child, right? It's not about telling you what to do. It's about actually thinking and cultivating a new depth of thought so that we can really understand the situation and the predicament that we're in. So with that, let me just talk a little bit about the overarching evolutionary frame that I want us to be thinking in. And one way to think about that is the sort of confluence and overlapping of biology and culture and technology, right? So we can think about evolution in terms of biological evolution, which goes very slowly, And we can also think about cultural evolution and technological evolution. And throughout history, there's a really deep relationship between the evolution of technology and culture, right? Often when you get a big invention like the plow or the printing press or the internet, it ends up having a huge impact on human thought and behavior and human culture. So those things have been evolving together over really long periods of time. And one of the ways to understand the predicament that we're in right now is that biological evolution is continuing to proceed very slowly. So fundamentally, biologically, we're very similar to our very distant ancestors. Cultural evolution has continued, but what's happening right now is technological evolution is proceeding at a pace that's sort of getting ahead of culture. So we seem to be lacking the cultural skills and capacities and norms and systems and structures and protocols to help us deal with the technology that's evolving, right? So I'll kind of come back to that, but it's one way to just realize why we have to update our thinking, because we have to update our culture to be able to manage and respond to the technological power that we now have available to us. And that's our challenge. It also might be one of the reasons why we actually have to try to slow down some of our technological development until our culture and our thinking can catch up to it. Another sort of theme that we touched on last time, again, is just sort of the movement from pre-modern to modern to postmodern culture. I'm going to weave that back in later because we're going to have to understand some of those thoughts that I brought up last time to really, I think, understand some of the content that is spreading through our digital media ecosystem. So with that, too, we have to keep in mind that humans are very sensitive to their environments, right? That coupling of culture and technology is so influential because we are what's called a neotenous species. It means we have a very extended childhood, right? Think about other animals and mammals. When they're born, they're pretty much ready to go and act out adult-like behavior in a very short span of time. Humans are radically different in that it takes us a really long time to become mature. We're very plastic and malleable and sensitive, and that is what enables us to be so adaptive, right? We're able to live in so many different kinds of environments, and we have so many different cultural manifestations because we are so adaptable and flexible. But the flip side of that is we're very sensitive. We are very much impacted by our environment, right? If a horse is born in two very different climates, it's just going to be a horse, and its skill set's going to be very limited, right? It's not going to be learning or impacted very much by its environment. Humans are very different. So we have to respect that, and we have to really deeply understand and appreciate that when we're thinking about how sensitive we have to be to our children's environments when they're growing up. So that's sort of it's a simple but really important underlying thought that we have to keep in mind when we're thinking about education and parenting. And it's actually underneath a lot of what we do at Waldorf schools and the kind of sensitivity and artistry and beauty that we try to bring to the experience and the environment of children. It's because we respect how sensitive and malleable and neotenous they are. So with that too, we're very wired to connect and to attune and to synchronize to other people. So we're deeply impacted by our environment, and we're deeply impacted by our human relationships. So, which is why taking that away and replacing human relationships and human attunement with digital screen-based technology has such an impact, right? We have to understand it in an evolutionary context. Like, this is what we're expecting when we're born, is the attunement and relationships and the synchronicity that we get with other people to learn so much about what it means to be a human. So if we're learning what it means to be a human from human relationships in nature, that's just so radically different than learning what it means to be a human from screens and digital technology and an absence of close attachment-based relationships. So the change from a play-based childhood to a phone-based childhood, really, it kind of gets right at that point that it blocks normal human development. It blocks normal human sleep and play and socializing. And this is why Jonathan Haidt calls phones experience blockers, right? You're sort of blocking this natural evolutionary developmental path. Another few points I want to pull out from a book that actually some of us here at school are reading together called Spirit-Led Community by Lisa Romero. And she talks about how, children, she sort of talks about the importance of environment and how the foundation for the free, independent individual is laid down in childhood, and how the consequences of human inventions are often not apparent for years or generations in the future. And that we're in this really interesting time right now, as I mentioned, in this context of technology evolving so quickly, where we have the capacity to understand and direct and control and determine technology, but we're actually having that capacity undermined by our technology, right? So it's like our ability to be free and independent thinkers who can actually consciously choose what do we want to invent and why, how do we want to use it, what do we want our children to be doing, what kind of environment do we want our children to be living in. We have the capacity to actually think about those things and make conscious choices about those things. But ironically, we've created an environment for ourselves that's making it harder to cultivate that very capacity, right? So it's a sort of negative feedback loop where it's a positive feedback loop, but it's negative in the sense that if we're going to be able to have the capacity to direct technology the way it needs to go, we have to somehow protect ourselves from the technology that's degrading our capacity. Right? Does that make sense? So it's quite a pickle, but we have to really get it and see it and proceed with caution. We also have to, Lisa points out, we have to be really clear about seeing the difference between the content of our thinking and our beliefs and our identity and our capacity as free people, right? Because we're so sensitive to our environments, a lot of the ways that we think and a lot of the things that we believe and even a lot of our identity is actually very much influenced by our environment. And a lot of young people today are getting caught up in traps where they're over-identifying with ideas and language and cliches and sort of different kinds of cultural memes. Like we're taking all this stuff in and we're sort of forgetting, we're sort of losing sight that we have this free and independent capacity within us that's not to be confused with that. It has to stay separate from that. And we have to actually cultivate the ability to be able to look at that and not overly identify with that. So it's a developmental journey. And another thing Lisa makes clear, which I'll actually just quote, is that technology that is designed to form unhealthy habits of thinking, feeling, and will impulses in the child in order to increase monetary wealth for others is immoral technology. Right? It's actually very clear and very simple if we sort of just look clearly at what the intention of social media is. It is to make money for other people, right? They're trying to attract our attention and get us to spend as much attention as possible so that they can make money. It's very clear. And by doing that, we're degrading our capacity to liberate ourselves from our relationship with that technology. But we don't seem, for some reason, maybe it has to do with it's where we're at in our cultural evolution right now, we're not quite at the point where we're seeing that with enough clarity to actually change our behavior consistently and collectively. So this is why we're talking about this. I'm just going to read that quote again because it's very clear and you've probably heard it before, but I have the sense that it hasn't fully landed in our culture yet. Technology that is designed to form unhealthy habits of thinking, feeling, and will impulses in the child in order to increase monetary wealth for others is immoral technology. So we have to also be able to make moral and ethical claims about what's good and what's bad. And that's harder to do nowadays, in part because of the sort of postmodern relativist context that we talked about last time, right? So last time we talked about this movement that we've gone through where we're exposed to so many different worldviews and we're having a deeper historical understanding of diversity, and we don't yet have clarity about how to fit all those different perspectives together to be able to say objectively what's right and what's wrong and what's true, what's not, what's good and what's bad, right? And my sense is that part of the reason why we have to see this in an evolutionary developmental context is because we can see where that story can go, right? It has to go to a place where we can reclaim the simple ability to be clear about what's good and what's bad for us and children, and what's right and what's wrong, and what's true and what's false, right? Right now we're sort of living in a post-truth world because we're lacking that moral clarity and that moral certainty. And it's not until we reclaim that moral clarity that we're going to be able to make the kind of statement that Lisa Romero makes there, where we can just see so clearly, this is immoral. We actually shouldn't be participating in this. So that's a little bit of framing the issue in an evolutionary context. I want to talk a little bit more about human development, because healthy brain development depends on getting the right experiences at the right age in the right order, right? We have what's called experience-expectant development. So this is a key pedagogical principle in education. There are things that should happen at certain times, right? Developmental appropriateness is key. And in the real world, age really matters. Like, think about not just now, but throughout human history, how much age matters. You do certain things at certain times. There's certain rituals you go through and rites you go through. And there's a difference between the elder and the teenager and the child. But online, everyone's treated the same, right? That's one of the weird things about digital space, is age sort of evaporates. And there might be words on a screen that tell you it's restricted to certain ages, but that's pretty much meaningless. If you have access to something, you're in that space as an avatar, just like everybody else, whether you're 12 or 52. So just to, again, step back and see, like, developmentally, that's just a weird thing where age just kind of no longer has meaning. And so online, children are plunged into just a whirlpool of adult content in no particular order, right? It's the opposite of developmental appropriateness. It's adult content in no order. It's sort of a choose your own adventure, mostly unconsciously, actually based on what's given to you through algorithms, right? It's the antithesis of conscious developmental appropriate pedagogy. It's almost like point by point the exact opposite of what that would be. And the kind of, experience expectant development that kids are expecting is through embodied relationships, right? So texts and emojis are not going to develop the parts of the brain that they're expecting from attunement and conversations. And puberty especially is a time when we should be particularly concerned about what kids are experiencing. It's actually not, one of the things that I was reading was arguing, it's not really that adolescence is a more stressful time, but it's a time when the brain is more vulnerable to the effects of particular sustained stressors, right? So it's a sensitive time. There are developmentally sensitive periods that environmentally, pedagogically, parentally, we have to be sensitive to and careful about. So again, like, the last thing you'd want to do is take someone in a sensitive developmental period of time and just throw them into an environment where it's just no holds barred. Another thing to name in terms of how people learn and how we're sort of oriented socially that impacts us when we're thrown into this digital world, we have sort of two deep and fundamental learning orientations. One is called conformity bias, and the other is called prestige bias, right? So conformity bias is basically you conform to what is most common. And you can think about, historically, this is just survival in a culture, right? You learn from seeing what everyone else is doing, and that's what you do. You conform. We have a deep bias for conformity. It's not a bad thing. It's completely necessary. But we also have prestige bias, which means you also look for the people who get the most social status, and you especially copy them, right? So in one sense, you're following what everyone else is doing. In another sense, you're following who gets the most status in your society. This is just deep, deep cultural patterns. And I'll talk a little bit later about how that plays out digitally, but just as a concept now, just to get it, these are things that are going to be playing out online. And if we're not thinking about what kids are conforming to and who's getting the most social status and prestige in their world, then we're not really helping them to make good choices around who they're copying and who they're trying to emulate, right? And the last thing I'll say on that front is that when we think about what's developmentally appropriate, peer orientation is itself part of the problem. And this is a tricky one, I think, for some parents to understand, because we have this sense that, children have to leave the home, they have to learn how to be independent. As they become older, their social group becomes more important to them than their parents and their family. And there's a natural, healthy developmental process that kids go through there. But it's also the case that, like, if you think historically and cross-culturally, it's actually not the case that it would be wise or healthy for young people to be really separated from adults and elders, right? And kids really do need adult guidance and mentorship and modeling, and they're not getting enough of that online. And I think there's ways in our culture right now where we almost justify them leaving our sort of protection too soon. There's a book on the table called Hold On to Your Kids, which sort of makes this argument in a more extended way, but the importance of actually keeping your kids close to you and making sure that you as parents are developmentally appropriate models and mentors for them as they navigate through their adolescence because of their conformity bias and their prestige bias. If all they're conforming to is other confused teenagers who are addicted to cell phones, that's not the best learning environment for them, right? And you as the adult have to be able to see that. And a point there is that actually self-esteem isn't just how good one feels about oneself, it's actually the independence of self-evaluations from the judgment of others, right? So to be able to evaluate yourself independently from how others judge you is a mark of real self-esteem. You can't actually feel good about yourself if how you feel about yourself is dependent on other people's judgments. But our sort of self-esteem, peer-oriented culture right now actually gives kids the message that, you know, in order to feel good about yourself, you have to get positive feedback from other people. So they're perpetually seeking affirmation and validation from their peers. But that it's actually a really unhealthy environment where all these insecure, low self-esteem young people are all seeking validation and affirmation from each other and constantly anxious about how many likes they're getting and how much feedback and validation they're getting, when in reality they need to find a way to distance themselves from that and individuate from that, right? Not just from you. They have to individuate from that so they can be good in themselves and not be so dependent on their peers. And it's actually mature elders and models who can help young people to do that, right? Because if you are following a mature elder and you can see that he or she is strong and grounded and not overly concerned about what other people think about them, that is the model by which you would cultivate your own self-esteem, right? But if you're surrounded by and mimicking people who don't have that groundedness and don't have that self-confidence, then it's just going to be reflected back to you and you're not going to actually move through that developmental threshold. Okay, so there's some thoughts about evolution and some thoughts about development and pedagogy and learning. I want to now, just in case there's anyone here who's not yet in the choir, I'm just going to share a little bit of data so we know kind of what we're working with here. And this is in the context of the fact that there's a long history of moral panics and worrying about kids, right? So we always have to wrestle with like, oh, are we just doing what, you know, our parents did and our grandparents did, like freaking out when actually the kids are going to be okay and maybe they're smarter than we are. And yeah, I think you have to acknowledge that there is a long history of people being worried about the next generation. But we have a lot of pretty objective and clear data that helps us understand the pickle that we're in. And again, it's in the context of we can also see how the relationship between culture and technology is fundamentally different now because culture is changing so much more quickly than it ever has in the past, right? So adapting to the plow and the printing press, like those were huge, but they happened kind of slowly and gradually over generations. So what we're dealing with now with digital media and AI is just, it is of a different order. Another thing to name too is that a lot of this data that I'm sort of going to be drawing on to help us understand what's happening, it shows another thing that's really clear that helps us see that this is objective and not just hysteria, is the fact that the timeline is so clear, right? Like it really is around 2010, 2012 that things start changing with the introduction of the iPhone and the smartphone. And some people like to argue that, oh, well, the reason kids are so depressed and anxious is because the world's so bad right now. It's just so stressful and it's all going to shit. And it's just, if you chart it year by year by year, the world didn't suddenly get worse in 2012. Like in that 3-year window, yes, there was a lot of stuff going on in the world, but no, it didn't just all of a sudden radically get a lot different. And it's also the case, if you look historically, that people don't actually get depressed when they face challenges collectively. So there's actually lots of great books written about the people who've gone through some of the biggest trials and tribulations of history. And actually, maybe counterintuitively, maybe not, that's often what leads to people calling themselves things like the greatest generation, right? You end up sort of pulling together, coming together, actually building up your sense of self and your sense of collective identity when you have to go through trials and tribulations, right? Character is forged in the fire of trials and tribulations. People need collective challenges to grapple with together. When you come together as a people, whether you're facing an enemy or a disaster of some kind, that's not what makes us depressed and anxious. What makes us depressed and not doing well mentally is when we feel lonely and isolated and useless, right? That's what gets us down mentally and emotionally. And that's what we're dealing with, because the world didn't get a lot worse in 2012. But what happened is people started getting world events sort of pumped into their eyes via phones, not as news, but as emotional and contagious posts, right? So that's the shift that happened, is that everything happening in the world, we're not just collectively responding to it as we previously would, but we're actually constantly getting it pumped into our senses, and in a way that sort of crossed a threshold from informational to sensational, right? Because the whole ecosystem is driven by attention capture, and attention capture is oriented to that which is the most sensational and the most attention grabbing. So that has led to increased polarization, increased sensationalism, and just the sort of intensity and negativity of information, because all of those things grab more attention. So it actually is really clear right now that it's not just because the world's getting worse that people are feeling worse. And it's not just a correlate with the emergence of smartphones and social media. It is causal. We have enough evidence to say it's not correlational, it's causal. And the 4 fundamental harms that I think this is from Jonathan Haidt points out: social deprivation, sleep deprivation, attention fragmentation, and addiction. And he also points to sort of 2 major trends that we're working with here. And I think one of the reasons his work is so important is because he's really trying to hold both of these things and not just one of them. On one hand, we are underprotecting children in the virtual world, right? And I've already been talking a bit about that and about why that's not developmentally appropriate for children to be in the virtual world in an unprotected way, because it's not developmentally appropriate. It's not at all in alignment with what they're expecting as biologically and culturally evolving beings. But at the same time, we're overprotecting them in the real world. And this is a whole nother thread in culture that he's tracking, of like, how has parenting and culture changed so that actually children aren't as free? They actually don't play as much. They don't take as many risks. They're actually not breaking as many bones, which might sound good, but it's not if you think about why. So both of these things are really going together, and we have to see them both so that we can reorient what we're doing. And there's to see the difference between the real world and the virtual world, and why we have to relate to them so differently, right? In the real world, it's embodied, it's synchronous, meaning we're interacting with people in real time. There's a high bar for entry and exit, so we have invested relationships, right? You're not just gonna talk to a stranger the same way you talk to your friend. It takes time and investment to build relationships with people in real life. And there's a lot of one-to-one and small group conversation, right? These are the things that make up for a meaningful and purposeful and developmentally appropriate human environment. But the virtual world is disembodied, it's asynchronous, there's a low bar for exit and entry, which leads to very disposable relationships as opposed to intimate and committed relationships. And it's one-to-many communication as opposed to one-on-one or small groups. So you're not getting real-time feedback from people. It's not relational at all in the same way. Liking and commenting is not the same as seeing someone's face, like respond to what you're saying. So much communication is nonverbal, right? So just we have to get really clear on how big these differences are. All right, so some data. In 2011, 23% of teens had a smartphone. By 2016, that was 79%. So in 5 years, almost tripled. 46% of teens now say they use their phones almost constantly. By age 12, 70% have a smartphone, over 90% by age 14. Something I heard recently on there's a good podcast called Raising Parents. It's a limited series that's coming out. There's only like 6 or 7 episodes. And they cited a stat there that 75% of teenagers go to bed with their phone, which is a really bad practice. Don't let your kid do that. And when they ask them why, most of them say, because my parent lets me. Which means they know they shouldn't. They know that they shouldn't, but their parent just lets them. And they make an important point there, which is that you're going to get pushback. Obviously, if your kid goes to bed with their phone in their room, and then you try to change and take it back, of course they're going to give pushback. But you have to be able to move through that. And it typically takes about 2 weeks, right, to push through something like that, where you sort of establish a new norm and a new habit. Some of us were talking about this before we started. You've got to push through those initial pushbacks once you're clear on what's good and what's bad and what's right and what's wrong. And even more importantly, maybe what you need to transmit to your child is that you know what's good and bad and right and wrong, and you will live your life accordingly, right? That's even more important than whatever the negative impact is of them going to bed with their phone, which is significant, so don't let them do it, please. Teens spend 50 hours a week, 6 to 8 hours a day on screen-based activities. As a point of comparison, in the 90s, the average teen spent less than 3 hours a day on television. All right, so in the sense of the moral panic of oh, kids are going to rot their brains watching TV, we're still talking about, yeah, but they watched a few hours of TV a day on average. This is 6 to 8 hours a day, the average teen. It's hard to believe. And again, I think another tension in this conversation is that perhaps in this community here, we're not at the extreme end of these statistics, but they're still relevant. They're relevant because some of us might be a little bit naive about the impact on our kids. And also, there's a cohort effect of even if our children are somewhat sheltered, they're still actually experiencing the overall cumulative cultural effects of so many kids being this disembodied. 40% of Americans under the age of 13 have an Instagram account. The average number of notifications for teens is 192 alerts per day. One study said the average teen touches their phone 2,500 times a day. It's hard to believe, but it's not a typo. Kids age 5 to 7, 30% use TikTok, age 5 through 7. 25% have a cell phone, and more than 75% use a tablet regularly. So, and this is, a lot of this data is looking at really this gap between 2011 and 2016. So in the span of 5 years, right, we're trying to absorb how fast things are changing compared to the time at which it usually takes culture to adapt and evolve. In the span of 5 years, social patterns, role models, emotions, physical activity, sleep patterns, all of that is just fundamentally different, right? It's very, very different for a teen with a smartphone in 2013, 2014 than it was in 2007, 2008. And now it's even accelerated more. So let's look at some mental health statistics. Major depression increased around 150% in boys and girls, and it had already doubled prior to COVID. Now almost 30% of girls have experienced what's defined as major depression. And again, some people like to say that, oh, well, that's not really as bad as it sounds because we're just so much more open about it now, right? So many more people are depressed because they're just talking about it more. But that's not true, and one of the ways we can know that that's not true is because also self-harm and suicide are increasing as well. So it's not just about reporting, it's about actual behavior and what's happening. In adolescent girls aged 10 to 14, self-harm tripled between 2010 and 2020. It doubled for older teens, age 15 to 19. Ages 15 to 19, suicide has increased 34% in boys, and it has increased 82% in girls. It's still much higher for boys. Boys commit suicide at a much higher rate than girls, which is important, and we might circle back to that. Age 10 to 14, over 100% increase for boys, and 134% increase in girls. And last thing I'll say about suicide is just, it's also important to take a step back and try. It's hard, but to try to really absorb what suicide is in an evolutionary context, right? Other animals don't commit suicide. And I don't think humans really committed suicide prior to modernity, right? It's a modern sort of mental affliction because of this evolutionary mismatch between culture and our environment, right? When we started living in environments where meaning and purpose and connection and attunement and what it meant to be a human being, when that became ruptured, people actually started to feel like it wasn't even worth living anymore. I mean, it's sort of, we sort of take it for granted almost, like, whoa, yeah, some people, it's a sickness and it's a mental, but it's important to see that it's a modern thing and it's an environmental thing. I don't think we have evidence that it's just consistent over time back when you go back through millennia, right? And again, biologically, we haven't changed that much because biological evolution is slow. So it's something in culture and environment and technology that's even creating that as even a phenomenon at all, which also means it doesn't have to exist. We don't have to actually live in a world where people commit suicide. We just have to change our environment. Cosmetic surgery has also skyrocketed. An industry-wide survey in 2023, 75% of plastic surgeons saw a spike in clients under 30. And the phrase Instagram face became really well known amongst plastic surgeons. There's a statement, mental health challenges are part of my identity. So they've done some big surveys about how many people would say mental health challenges are part of my identity. You identify as someone who has a mental health challenge. In the boomer generation, it was just about 30% of people, 25% of men, 34% of women. For Gen X, that jumped from 30 to 50%, 47 for men, 53 for women. For millennials, that jumped to 60%, and we also started to see men and women separating more. So amongst millennials, 56% of men, 67% of women say that mental health challenges are part of their identity. And for Gen Z, it's jumped to over 70% for women. Over 70% of Gen Z women say that mental health challenges are a part of their identity. So something environmental is going on there. In 2023, 1/3 of college students say they feel anxiety less than half the time. And so one thing to think about here too is, there's been some exposure recently of social media companies. So there was something called the Facebook Files in 2021, where internal documents were revealed showing intentional manipulation of identity to hook users, particularly to Instagram, right? So they are intentionally trying to manipulate your sense of self and identity to get you hooked on their platform. That's how they make billions of dollars. It's actually very, very straightforward. And now TikTok currently is being sued by 13 states for harming and failing to protect children. They have intentionally addictive software, and they intentionally target children because they know children do not have the ability to create healthy boundaries for addictive content. This is a quote from an internal document from TikTok. Compulsive usage correlates with a slew of negative mental health effects like loss of analytic skills, memory formation, contextual thinking, conversational depth, empathy, and increased anxiety. So executives acknowledge the negative effect on body image and the popularity of suicidal ideation and eating disorders in their content, right? So a lot of the content is also explicitly spreading and sort of tuning into that conformity bias and actually spreading actually harmful behaviors of some of the most attractive and addictive content. So another thing to point out here, I won't linger on it too long, but there are big differences between boys and girls. There's a whole separate talk where we could kind of go into how boys and girls are different, but you actually can't really look at the research on mental health and addiction and technology without acknowledging that males and females are not identical, physically or psychologically. And that's important to understand for educators and parents. And especially I do want to talk a little bit about maybe girls more than boys. But one thing to note is that anxiety and depression are showing up most in girls. Those are internalizing disorders. Girls tend to internalize their mental health problems more, which means their symptoms are experienced internally, like anxiety and depression, whereas boys tend to externalize their symptoms. So their behavior is affected, and they end up with an ADHD diagnosis, right? So in girls, we're seeing depression and anxiety because they're internalizing the symptoms. In boys, we see spike in ADHD because they're externalizing. So those are deep patterns that pre-existed the technology, right? Because our biology is pretty set, but the way that our biology is responding to the technology is taking boys and girls in different directions when it comes to their health. Girls typically use social media more. Boys use more YouTube, games, and text-based apps. Girls are more visually oriented, using platforms like Snapchat, Instagram, Tumblr, and Pinterest. The thing with girls, and I think because they are more oriented toward community and communication, and the social pressure seems to be affecting girls a lot worse than boys. For boys, it's overstimulation, it's developmentally inappropriate content, it's actually dopamine dysregulation because they're not getting enough exercise, they're eating bad, they're on video games and YouTube. It's bad for their brains, it's bad for their dopamine regulation, and it's bad for their behavior. Right? For girls, they're oriented toward a social world and friend making, and the online world of friends that they're getting is so dysfunctional and toxic. It's really quite heartbreaking. One of the books I put back there is called American Girls, and each chapter looks at a different age group, and it's sort of a journalistic approach. There's this person going around the country, interviewing teenagers, collecting data, just really kind of doing in-depth research on the experience of girls at different ages in America. And the thing that I think we have to grapple with and not be naive about is the intensity of the sexualization and pornography online. I mean, I talked earlier about how age disappears when you go online, and we have to accept that that means exposure to adult content, which means sexual content and pornographic content. And the normalization of porn, the pressure that girls get to send nudes and to be sexting, the types of prestige that we're seeing by people like the Kardashians, like it's crazy how the most famous people are the people who are not exemplifying the norms and values of any civilization that's going to last very long. The shift in how girls are spending their time online, perpetually having anxiety about how they're being seen, how many likes they're getting, what kind of social feedback they're getting in that social media world. It's just so unhealthy. And the culture of social media, really reading through these accounts, it's really interesting, all these conversations and quotes with 13-year-olds and 14-year-olds, and how they're so articulate about how they see how weird it is, and they see how bad it is, but they can't stop. And it's a recurrent theme in reading about these topics. You find that both parents and children have enough awareness to know that they shouldn't be doing this. But all everyone says is, well, yeah, but everyone else is doing it. Like if I wasn't in this really toxic, sexualized, pornified social world, I would have no social world at all. And parents pretty much say the same thing. Like, yeah, I know it's bad, but I don't want my kid to be isolated. So somehow as a culture, we've got to push through that, and we've got to re-normalize not going along with unhealthy norms and not conforming to things that don't make sense, and actually allowing people to cultivate, again, that self-esteem that allows you to actually not have your esteem be dependent on other people. And there's so many examples in the book. If you really want like a sobering look at the experience of girls, I recommend the book American Girls. And they talk specifically about Snapchat and Instagram and how much nudity there is on those things. I mean, Snapchat, if you're not familiar, it's things that don't last very long. And at first people thought like, oh, well, people won't want to use that because they don't want to use things that don't last very long. But that incentivizes things that are inappropriate, right? Because you have the thought as a kid, oh, well, it's going to go away, so I can do something that you wouldn't normally do. But it gets screenshotted, it gets shared. So there's ridiculous amounts of nudity and vulgarity and inappropriateness happening, especially on Snapchat, because the teenage brain tricks himself into thinking they'll get away with it because it just happens in a snap. Anyway, it's there's also some heartbreaking stories in the book about the inner dialogue of these young girls, 13 to 14-year-old girls, where they'll get a random text from a boy, hey, send me some nudes, N-U-D-Z. And the thought process that she shares of just like, oh, maybe he must like me. Maybe he likes me. Maybe this will be my first boyfriend. Maybe this will be my first kiss, and like it's becoming, oh, maybe I can do it without showing my face so nobody will know who it is, And she's like working up this whole sweet, sort of naive, wholesome, typical 13-year-old scenario, trying to somehow justify that this maybe could be an okay and good thing, because apparently the worst thing for a 13-year-old girl is to not be liked by boys and to not have a boyfriend, right? So to be pulled into something like that, and then in this example that I read, the boy texts back and he's like, yeah, sorry, like no offense or anything, but there's a high school kid who will buy us alcohol if we can prove that we can send him nudes. So like, I just thought like you'd be cool with that. Like, is that cool? And you sort of also get smacked in the face with like, yeah, that's how teenage boys think. Like, but I just think we're really naive in general about how immature our kids are actually, and how immature the level of discourse and interaction that's happening in these texts and in these online spaces is. And we've got to find a way to up-level the expectations for how our kids are interacting with each other, and the kinds of modeling that they have for what does it even mean to be dating someone, to fall in love with someone? What's the context of your first kiss, right? And do we really want to let so many young girls be in social situations like that where she's getting pulled into just a really unhealthy introduction to sexuality and romance and love? Boys, I already mentioned the difference there is that for them ADHD is the big crisis, and that relates more to what has been called the domestication of childhood, and what Jonathan Haidt talks about is sort of like overprotecting outside. I think the overprotection of play in real life is affecting boys more, and the underprotection of digital space is probably influencing girls more. So there's another thread I want to pull out here, and I'll try to go over this one more quickly. But there's actually a couple more threads, right? So one is the evolutionary context. There's understanding, development, and learning. There's just coming to grips with how unfortunate and inappropriate the online world has become for young people, the effect that that's having on their mental health, right? So that's where we're at. There's another piece to this, which is, it kind of relates to what Jonathan Haidt's talking about in terms of culture, but it's not just overprotecting, and it's not just taking away play. There's also a way that we're having trouble figuring out now how to respond to the mental health crisis, right? So we're coming to awareness that there's a problem, but in some ways we don't yet seem to have the maturity of knowing what the most effective way to respond to this situation is, and we're sort of over-therapetizing our culture, right? It's like an overly therapeutic sort of, talking a lot about trauma, talking a lot about stress and depression, talking in a way that actually doesn't help and might make things worse, right? So it's sort of like an added kicker of once we're sort of making the problem worse by the way that we're actually talking to our kids about mental health. So we need some course correction there as well. So there's a sort of difference between having a healthy childhood, which is what we all want, and having a therapeutic approach to the mental disease of children, right? So if we're treating kids like they all are now traumatized, and we're like sending them all to therapists, and we're sort of overly coddling them because we're so worried about how they're doing emotionally, that's also not helping. So we kind of have to get back to the basics of what establishes a healthy childhood, right? And one of the interesting studies I've looked at looks at the childhoods of exceptional people. And the themes that come out of this study are high expectations, unusual and unconventional environments, right? So actually giving a child the chance to be in an environment or have some of their experience in an environment that's not just whatever like the conventions of their society are. Lots of free time and alone time and self-directed learning, and tutoring and small group learning, right? Those are basically the main themes of a pretty broad and extensive study of looking at like the most exceptional people, and that's a broad understanding of exceptional. But I think that's relevant here, and it actually, in some ways it makes it more doable, I think, for parents. Like, it's simple. We have to simplify, right? We don't need to talk more about, we don't need to send our kids to therapists. We need to actually give them more alone time, right? We need to allow ourselves to be less conventional and conformist. We have to try to find learning environments that are small, right? And where you're not just swept up in conformity, where you're actually allowed to be a little bit countercultural. There's also something that's called the treatment prevalence paradox, which is that we've seen, each decade has seen a doubling of expenditure on mental health since the 80s. So we just keep throwing more and more and more money and attention and resources into mental health while everything gets worse. So that's just something to note, that I think the way that we're approaching mental health is not working. And part of the reason is because we're actually developing what's called more of an external locus of control. And it's fundamentally opposed to good mental health. So when you actually outsource your locus of control and you feel like experts have to tell you what to do, and this has happened a lot with parenting, parents are sort of losing their confidence and feeling like they need experts to tell them what to do. So maybe even by sending them to a therapist, for instance. That makes your locus of control outside of yourself, and that's just going to make it harder for you to develop that self-esteem where you actually are a free and independent thinker who's grounded and knows what's right and wrong and knows what's good and bad for yourself. We've also a little bit over-focused on happiness. If we want our kids to be happy all the time, then we can't actually help them weather the storms that they have to go through. So again, it begins a little bit difficult and paradoxical for parents. You want your kids to be happy, but happiness isn't a goal. Happiness is a byproduct of living a good life. You don't focus on happiness. You don't focus on trauma. You don't focus on mental health. You do the things that will lead to those things. You have to be more indirect and more subtle. We also have to understand just the world that we're living in. I mentioned how we've given so much more money into healthcare. This is a can of worms, but I'll just name it. The profit motive in healthcare is kind of similar to the profit motive in social media, right? They get more money the more you're in the system. The more that you are enabled, the more that you are dependent on experts and specialists, that's kind of how that's how their economy works, right? Just like for social media, the more attention you give them, the more money that they're making. And one thing to be tracking, the next lecture I'm going to give is all about AI. So I won't talk about AI much tonight, but one thing to note is that during COVID, over $3 billion was invested into AI mental health startups with the premise that we can give AI therapy to everyone, and that'll solve all our problems, right? I think that's one of the dumbest things humans have thought of in a really, really, really long time. It's not the direction that we need to go, right? The human element, if there is goodness in therapy, it's in the human element. It's in the fact that you're interacting with someone who actually thinks about you when you're not there. And that's actually one of the, there are some studies that show that quality of having a relationship with somebody who cares about you and actually thinks about you when you're not with them is one of the things that contributes to having a productive therapeutic relationship, right? AI can't do that. It's a deep, deep confusion about what it even means to be a human being, to think that AI could be therapists for everybody. So what actually helps? Time with family, exercise, productive work, task orientation instead of state orientation, right? So being focused on work that you have to do instead of focused on yourself and how you're feeling. So things we don't want to do, telling kids to pay attention to their feelings and getting them to focus on their self, it just makes things worse. Don't ask them all the time how they're doing. You can ask them about their day. How was class? How's that project you're working on? How are your friends doing, right? Getting them to think and talk about other things is what's healthy and normal. Constantly reflecting on yourself and thinking about yourself is not healthy or normal. Talking about trauma is not, trauma-informed doesn't mean talking about it, right? And having a trauma-informed school doesn't mean treating all kids like they have trauma. And these are like really basic things, but we're getting them wrong. Schools are getting them wrong and parents are getting them wrong. We're talking about trauma and we think we're being trauma-informed and we think we're helping, and we're actually being counterproductive, because trauma-informed means being aware of what somebody may or may not have gone through and then doing the things that are going to help them, like getting them to stop focusing on themselves, getting them to eat right and exercise and actually have quality relationships. Another thing we need to be careful about is diagnosis. Diagnosis is not neutral. It changes how we and others see us. And our sense of efficacy can be diminished if we start to identify. Again, we're so over-diagnosing people that it's affecting their identity, and then it becomes a feedback loop, because how do you ever heal if that's just who you are? So diagnosis is really dangerous, and we're actually not being nearly careful enough with how we're diagnosing children. Another thing that's key is just family connection, right? We as families have to reclaim our authority and our rights and our responsibilities to raise our children. And another pattern that's really sad is that almost 30% of Americans have cut off a family member. And when you survey people who have cut off a family member and you ask them why, most of them say because their therapist suggested it. It's a common pattern, right? People have issues. They go see a therapist. They convince their therapist that their family member is toxic and that they would be healthier without them. It's kind of not okay, actually, because the situation probably is a little bit more complicated than that. And there's a lot of parents who really love their kids and their kids won't talk to them anymore because they've been swept up in some cultural trend about how to reinterpret their parents. Another thing about mental health studies, it's kind of a shit show to think about the lack of quality and methodology of a lot of what's happening in the world of psychology. But one big distinction we can make is sort of backward-looking studies versus forward-facing studies. And that so many of things that we see are sort of like listing symptoms and then looking back to find the reasons why, right? But you're always going to be able to find reasons why you have problems. A real high-quality study would actually look at something that happens to people and then follow them into the future and see how that plays out, right? And when you actually follow groups of people who've been through some significant trauma, you see that actually their outcomes aren't that much worse than other people. Like the impact of trauma has actually been greatly exaggerated. It's a whole nother can of worms, but it's just we have to come back to common sense on some of these things and not outsource our expertise so much for other people. Okay. There's, in terms of guidelines, I told you I wouldn't give you a list of 5 or 10 things, but I do want to try to be helpful. And I will wrap up here soon and we can get to some Q&A. So let me just name a few more sort of proactive things that I want to land. And then there's one other sort of thread that we can explore, and then we'll do Q&A. So just to get down to some basics, like where we sort of common sense need to go, and hopefully can start to generate more collective agreement about some of these things, because I don't know how we change the culture that we're living in unless we actually think together and agree together about what needs to happen and then try to make it happen. So internet adulthood is currently set at 13. So that's a real problem. It should be 16 or 18, I think. So that's something legally, like we actually need our representatives to make some significant changes there. It's actually not okay that a 13-year-old, when my daughter turned 13, I got an email from Google telling me that now she was an adult and I would no longer, have oversight over her Gmail account. And that's pretty much the case for all of the people who tell themselves that they can protect their kids from being online because they have like the family control apps or whatever. Well, those are cut off at 13. After 13, they're pretty much legally free online. So that needs to be changed to 16 or I'd say 18. We need to start treating social media apps more like alcohol, tobacco, and gambling because they're harmful to society. As parents, we need to be more like gardeners and less like carpenters, right? I think there's a book by Alison Gopnik called The Gardener and the Carpenter or something, but you sort of need to, you can't overly control and micromanage like a carpenter. You're not going to fit your kids exactly like a carpenter would. You need to just sort of let the flowers grow and leave more space, more spaciousness. What you do is more important than what you say. When it comes to therapy, parent-based approaches are more important. So if you or your child are having issues, you should go see a therapist. Don't send your kid to the therapist. Parents getting help from therapists is a lot more helpful than sending kids to therapists. And one of the reasons, which we should understand why, is because of the power differential, right? Are you an adult going to a mental health professional? You can push back. You can take it or leave it. You can say, I don't like this therapist. I'm going to go see somebody else. You find what works for you. Kids don't have that agency and that autonomy. They're much more powerless to the authority of the therapist. The therapist is going to have much more of an impact on the child than you as an adult. If a therapist is working with a teen or a child, it should be targeted and specific, and the parent should be kept in the loop as much as possible. Thinking about doing things for others helps us feel better. Being asked about ourselves is not really helpful. So again, in your day-to-day conversation, trying to open up conversation about something other than how they're feeling and how they're doing is just helpful. And kids need influential choices, and this is one of the things that's been taken away. There's some cool cross-cultural studies, like there's a documentary about kids in Japan that shows how much more free choice they have than American kids, right? Kids have lost, and this is especially important for boys, but it's important for both. They need to do things that matter. They have to be able to make choices that might have negative consequences that actually matter in their life, and you have to let them do that. So it's not an easy thing, but it's a really important principle. So that's a lot. I could stop, and I could open it up to Q&A. I just want to name, there's one other whole topic that we could go down, which relates a little bit to what I talked about last time, because it has to do with polarization and living in a postmodern world. And so looking at the data, looking at the situation that we're in, we see age matters, right? Young people are being affected. And gender, sex matters, right? Boys and girls are being affected differently. And actually what's become clear is that there's a whole nother distinction that can be made where data really bifurcates. And that actually has to do with polarization and how people identify politically actually has a big impact on their experience online. And some of the cultural trends we're seeing are actually influencing people who identify as being on the left more than on the right. And that's interesting. It's a data point, it's true, and it's interesting. And it relates to some of the themes around postmodern culture and what people call woke culture and cancel culture. And the way that that's impacting certain demographics of people is something that we could grapple with. I could talk more about that maybe if people are interested. Maybe I'll just name that, and if people are interested in it, I could say more about it, or we can go in a different direction. But just one of the, and this is something that Jonathan Haidt has written about in some of his blogs, but not so much in his books yet, is if you really start disambiguating the data on mental health, it's young women who have a leftist political identity who are actually being the most impacted by a lot of this mental health trends. And I think we can understand why. And a lot of our, independent school spaces, a lot of people who are reading these books, that's very relevant data for them, and they should be trying to understand why that is. Because my sense is that, just briefly to kind of move from that data point to a sort of broader closing, some of the trends that are happening in culture right now are a part of this bigger arc of the breakdown of feeling like we know what's true and what's good. And there's also part of the story that's being told and propagated online is a sort of overly critical, overly negative, overly cynical frameworks and ideologies, right? So things that are very critical about the modern world, very critical about America, very critical about history, just very negative, right? There's a sort of negative valence to how we think about history, recent history, when we think about the heartbreaking facts of slavery and war and colonization. It just starts to build up a sort of depressing story. And if our political identity takes on those stories in a way that's sort of out of balance with a broader view of an actual evolutionary story that includes everyone, and you actually identify with the villain in that story, and you're also taught to sort of frame things in terms of victims and perpetrators, and you're the victim, and the world's going to shit, and basically, as far as you can tell, adults really don't know what's going on or what to do, and it all kind of seems like just a sort of pointless evolutionary journey of like atoms and molecules and selfish genes. There's no underlying purpose anymore to people's lives, And that's actually the broader arc that we have to grapple with. And some of the folks that some of us are talking about in regard to thinking about technology, even I'd say, people like Jonathan Haidt and Johan Hari, and Jared Lanier, and Yuval Harari, Shoshana Zuboff, a lot of people who are grappling with how technology is impacting culture, and they're wanting to point a better way forward, and they're really critical about what's happening, but they're not actually, they don't themselves actually have a story that brings inherent value and goodness back into the world and gives us a place to stand where we can actually say, no, this is where we're going, this is why we're here, this is who we are, this is what we need to do, right? It's still sort of like, yeah, this stuff is bad and we want to do better, but ultimately, yeah, it's just a social construction, or it's just a story, or it's just, like your opinion, man. And I think that there's a deep connection there that we're going to have to find a way to grapple with as humans. How do we ground ourselves in a shared story that includes everyone, that gives us a direction so that we can actually generate the collective will to make our environment better and more healthy for raising children? Because if we don't get the story right, we don't have a narrative arc to what we're doing and why we're here, we're not going to be able to collaborate and cohere as a collective planet of people. And it's going to take a lot of work. It's going to take a lot of will. It's going to take a lot of collective will and clarity of thought to actually make the kind of changes that we have to make. We actually have to reorient our entire technological and media and informational infrastructure to be oriented around human values. That's what we have to do. If we don't orient our technology to be in alignment with human values, we're not going to have healthy humans. But how do we do that if we don't have shared agreements about human values? And how do we have shared agreements about human values if we don't have a shared story that includes everyone? Which is why I think the evolutionary framework is really important. So that's kind of the gist of it. I'll leave it there. Thank you all for listening. It's always, it's a lot. It's always a lot. It's intentional. Because there's a lot to say and there's a lot to figure out. Do we have any questions or reflections?
I have a reflection and a question. So my reflection is, I think the thread in my mind that with pushing aside the political piece that kind of covers a lot of the ground that you brought up is those brain chemicals that cause things like anxiety and depression have existed for thousands, hundreds of thousands of years, and they serve a biological purpose. But they don't give a shit about the last 20 years of social media. They're designed to, anxiety is designed to protect you when the tiger comes. Depression is designed to conserve energy when you're in a hopeless situation. So part of the way that I think about how do you counteract those things is act like a cave person. What did they do? When the sun came up, they got up. They went out to find food. They did the tasks they needed to do. They brought that stuff back to the tribe. They raised the children together. And when it got dark, they went to sleep, right? And they felt good about that because the brain chemicals were driving them toward that behavior.
Yeah.
That's not what social media is, though, right?
Yeah.
So I think there's something very simple to think about. Is like we should act more like cave people.
Yes.
And then and I would also say in your question about suicide, the reason why suicide didn't exist in cave people is because they were eaten by a saber-toothed tiger when they got to that point.
Yeah, maybe.
My question is, as the parents, what behaviors do we need to watch out for of the things that we're doing, right? Because I feel like all this stuff that you're describing teens doing, we do it too, right? We come home and sit on the couch and look at our phone. We take our phone to bed. We text. We go on Facebook. We're looking to see how many people liked our Facebook post. We communicate with our family over 2-sentence text instead of calling them or meeting them in person. How much of a role does that play in trying to course correct what our children are doing?
Yeah, it matters a ton. And I'd like to just pull the two things you said together because I agree with you about, living more, maybe not like a cave person, but the way I'd put it is, yeah, like, again, the evolutionary context is important. Understanding how our ancestors lived and the different sort of stages humanity has gone through. And how do we reintegrate those in a healthy way? And the more you can do that, the more it'll actually help answer your question, because that's partly what you'll be modeling, right? Like, the more we're actually able to integrate ancient ways of being and connection to nature is actually sort of maybe the fundamental point of what you were saying in the first part there, is we actually have to reconnect to nature. And that's actually, I won't pass up the opportunity to make the observation that is one of the root insights of Waldorf education, is this awareness that we're living in a modern world that's been divorced from the sort of agrarian and pre-agrarian ways of living. And now how do you create an educational environment that actually keeps those pre-modern ways of living in the educational system, right? Like, we didn't have to used to teach farming because we were farmers. When we stopped being farmers, we had to teach farming. Right? Like, it's a deep, simple point. And psychologically, there'd be a lot to unpack on that same theme in regard to the different stages that we go through. The tendency is, with every threshold you kind of go through, like last time we talked about going from archaic to magic to mythic to mental to integral, potentially. In the integrals, when you're integrating all the prior stages of your being to be healthy and whole. But at each threshold, you can either transcend and include, or you can sort of transcend and fragment. And the historical pattern has been crossing a threshold means losing the past, distancing yourself from the past. So our mission, actually now, our journey collectively, I think, is to reintegrate the past in a healthy way. We have to find the essential, functional, evolutionary, adaptive, healthy structures and norms and ways of being in the world that our ancestors figured out that we've lost touch with, and reintegrate those while having a cell phone in our pocket, right? It's not about not moving forward. We have to reintegrate the modern and the postmodern too. But we can integrate smartphones into our lives if we're grounded in nature, if we're grounded in the cycles of the sun, if we're grounded in healthy organic food, right? If we're grounded in real human relationships and tribes and communities, then we can maybe not be on the smartphone in front of our kids so much. And if we don't do those things, it's really hard. What we're finding out is it's really hard to be a postmodern human who's separated from our archaic and agrarian and pre-agrarian ways of being in the world and trying to somehow muster the willpower to, like, be awake and present and not sucked into this technology. Like, we don't have the capacity because we're not grounded, right? So all that stuff fits together. I think you're totally on it. Those are the things we have to do, and it can be a positive feedback loop, I think. And I think that's actually a key insight. Is it's going to be really hard to muster the will to get off our phones and be good models if we don't have some sort of deeper reintegration happening where we're actually back in touch with those deeper cycles and ways of being. Yeah, thank you.
It was the Harvard study, longitudinal study for sort of like happiness. I mean, this is what it was looking at sort of people who were born in the 1950s and following longitudinally through their lives. That showed the most significant factor in sort of like happiness and what people would self-report as a successful life was connection. Right, relationships, and the last couple things that you said that really hit home to me. We think about how social media or phone or whatever, it's not a real connection, right? There might be someone on the other end, but it's not a human in the way that we see them and connect with them. And I just think that's so crucial. And maybe we can look at the way that society has changed through the modern world, where we used to have a lot more connections through religious affiliations, for example. I think you might have spoken about that last time, how that has changed. And then nothing has replaced that, right? So not that I'm being critical of that fading away or saying that was a bad thing or a good thing, but it's a human connection that is no longer applicable. And we haven't really found a way to replace that.
Yeah.
And I mean, maybe that's kind of, at least what I think when you're getting to how do, where are we going to go? How do we find that shared meaning? Like, what is the next step? Like, maybe in a small community, it's easy. It's easier.
Yeah, it's so key. The loss of religion, the death of God, the secularization of society, the modernization, industrialization, secularization, disenchantment of the world, those are all ways of characterizing modernity, which we talked about a bit last time. And yeah, we threw away some babies with the bathwater there, and we're trying to figure out what aspects of that pre-modern, religious, sacred, enchanted world, how do we reintegrate some of that, but in an authentic sort of postmodern way, right? This is our work. This is what we have to figure out. And a lot of people that I know who are thinking and working in these spaces, in these conversations, that's exactly what they're trying to figure out. Some people were talking about trying to figure out, like, what is the religion that's not a religion, right? Like, how do you have a religion that fills those qualities that we need in a religion, but it's not a religion in the pre-modern mythic sense of religion, because we've outgrown that, right? It's not about going back to pre-modern beliefs. It's about inhabiting social structures that are religious and have a sacred spiritual religiosity to them. It's a deep question, and I think my sense is, there's some of my friends work at a center called the Center for World Philosophy and Religion, and this is their question, right? And they're trying to sort of unpack and clarify what are the underlying principles and even like metaphysical claims that we have to be able to make and see and understand and validate for ourselves to sort of have a grounded civilization. Like, how do we ground the global civilization that's coming in actual values and some sense of the sacred world that we're living on? And how do we actually come to agreement about really complicated topics, like how do we know what's real and what's true? But yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head. But that, again, to me, it's so essential that we see ourselves as part of this journey, this evolutionary journey that's unfolding. And we've moved through these historical stages, and there's a lot of future in front of us, and it could go a number of different directions. And right now, so many of our pictures and images and visions of the future are just perpetuations of like the dysfunctional aspects of the present. Like what percentage of futuristic ideas are dystopian, right? Way too many. We're experiencing a real failure of imagination when it comes to envisioning the future. There are amazing futures possible, but they're not extensions of technological evolution, right? Well, this will be a main theme of my next talk about AI. We're deeply misguided and confused if we sort of take our current cultural norms and economic and political structures and think that that's just like the way it is, and then technology is going to keep evolving and the future is going to be that. No. History tells us that culture has to change. Consciousness has to change, right? Like ways of being in the world, values have to change. What we think of as religion has to change, right? It's those interior, ideational, cultural elements that actually have to shift. We're not done evolving in that sense. And we have to bring technology into alignment with that, with the new values that haven't been clarified yet, right? Just like the sort of like liberty, equality, and fraternity were the values that we were able to forge democracy and the Industrial Revolution sort of in this sort of imaginal chamber of liberty, equality, and fraternity, right? We need a new imaginal vision of like what are the values that are going to ground a sort of AI-powered technosphere. So it's a big task, but at least we can sort of see, like, yeah, that's kind of what has to happen somehow. Maybe. There's a Buddhist teacher named Robert Bea who's pretty good. And he's got a book called Seeing That Freeze. It's a good book, and he's a good teacher. But the idea there is just that, and this is part of why we have to do this work of thinking about this stuff, because there actually is a way in which it is just the shift of perspective and just the different way of seeing the pickle that we're in that can be liberating in itself. And it's from the space of that liberation that we have the creativity and the energy to actually generate some of the answers that we need. Right? We're not going to be able to do that if we're not, in some sense, free thinking, individuated individuals who are able to see clearly and think clearly together. And that is a developmental capacity that should be the whole point of education. So at least, we know it's not easy, but at least we know what we have to do and the kind of capacities that we have to cultivate. Sherry.
It just seems to me that we're not going to get a sort of overarching program that's going to be the wise, great way to go, that everybody's going to agree on. The future is actually going to be born in small communities where people who know each other agree and find their sureness in themselves, and then start practicing and doing, and then they'll find connections with others. I mean, it kind of was the same thought I had at the end of your first talk.
Yeah.
Is coming up for me again.
Yeah.
That it's the future is actually, we have to create it amongst ourselves and forge it.
Yeah.
And then we'll recognize other people who also have good ideas.
Yeah.
And are doing it, and we become.
Yeah.
We recognize each other. We learn from each other, and that it grows sort of grassroots.
Yeah. Yes, that's so important. Thank you. It was appropriate last time, and it's maybe even more appropriate this time, because it's so important. Because once we start doing big picture thinking and thinking about humanity as a whole and the planet as a whole, and we have that sort of world-centric, cosmocentric perspective, it can sound top-down and totalitarian. And it doesn't have to be, and actually it can't be. And that's actually part of the tension with AI and the more dystopian paths that are possibly opening up, is having the power to actually surveil and nudge and control a whole planet of people through some sort of AI-driven digital ecosystem is a real danger, because that kind of power driven by a not conscious enough person or group of people will lead to outcomes we don't want. It'll be too top-down and too controlling of people. It has to be decentralized, I think. And I think that is the pattern, too. You see things popping up throughout history, and then they kind of spread. And that's actually one of the take-homes I wanted to leave you all with, was really just that, of like, a lot of this stuff can seem overwhelming, and we're overwhelmed because, we're absorbing content and news and information from around the world, and we're not just talking about our own kids. I'm sharing data about like the whole country. It's just very overwhelming to be in that mental, emotional space of like taking it all in. But I think the appropriate response is to, as the poet David White says, you have to start close in, right? Start close in with the first step, the step that you don't want to take. And it's right here. And we have to take responsibility for ourselves. You can't change the world. I can't create a new religion. I can't change AI. I can't tell Zuckerberg or Bezos what to do. We have a vote coming up. We'll see how much influence or change that creates one way or the other. We have to accept in some level like what we can control. We can change ourselves. We can be more in touch with the sun and not be on our phone in front of our children. We could take responsibility for our children and not let them take their phones to bed, right? We can create schools where kids don't have phones. Like, we have to take responsibility for ourselves and our communities. And I think that's the only way. It's the only way forward. And somehow that has to be enough. It'll spread. Yeah. Any other last thoughts? No? Thank you all so much for your time. I really appreciate it. January AI. January 14th, we'll be talking all about artificial intelligence.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So
Thank
much.
you. Yeah, thank you.